Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I move the motion standing in my name in relation to the aged care crisis facing Australia under the Rudd government. Mr. Deputy President, the Rudd government is failing senior Australians in a desperate need of access to timely access to quality aged care services. They're failing senior Australians and their families. And right now we are facing a crisis in aged care which will only get worse if it is left unaddressed by the Rudd government moving forward. We have a government that is spending like drunken sailors. They've been going on spending spree after spending spree. They've been borrowing money to give it away. We've had billions of dollars in $900 cheques go out there, including to people overseas, including to people in jail, including to people who are dead. We've had the waste and mismanagement with the so-called building the education revolution. Waste and mismanagement. Billions of dollars being splashed around like there's no tomorrow. We've got $1.7 billion of overspending, $7 to $8 million for science. We've got spending, yet in the very crucial, very important health and ageing portfolio, what have we got? No action, budget cuts, reviews to waste time or gain time, if you look at it from the government's point of view, from a political point of view, no action whatsoever, and the government has got their head in the sand while people out there are struggling to get timely access to the aged care services they need. Now, Mr. Deputy President, Australia has an ageing population. And the ageing of our population is one of the biggest social issues that we're facing as a nation. And of course, with an ageing population comes, of course, a significant increase in demand for a range of related services, including aged care services, including a need for aged care facilities. Now, what's been happening is that under the regulatory regime, under the funding regime currently in place, it is no longer financially viable for providers to invest in the facilities that are needed to provide high care services in aged care in particular. Our aged care system today is over-regulated, it is underfunded, and it is failing to deliver a good standard of care. And at a time when there is increasing demand for services, providers are walking away from the industry because of the non-viability of high care and the compliance demands of the government. Senior Australians are increasingly finding they are unable to access the services and care they need, and this is, of course, putting additional pressure on our hospital system. And in the 2009-10 budget, while there is, as I've mentioned, a spendathon going on, when there's waste and mismanagement going on, in the area of aged care, what do we see? Budget cuts. Budget cuts. When the health portfolio is supposed to be one of the high priority areas of the government, or so we were led to believe in the lead up to the last election. But no, while everywhere else the government is throwing money around, in health and ageing, we're talking budget cut after budget cut after budget cut, inaction and complete ignoring of the significant crisis that is currently going on. Now, what's happened is, as I've mentioned, there is increases in demand coming from the ageing population. And the department goes through an exercise every year, which is called the aged care approvals round. And the department determines, well, what is going to be the need? What is going to be the need for services? And they come up with a figure, and it's broken down by state. In fact, it is broken down by what is called planning regions. So they map out, based on population, based on demographics, based on a whole series of trends, these are the number of services we need. And you've only got to look at how those numbers have been developing over the last 2 years to get a sense of the extent of the crisis that we're facing, and it's been worse It's been worse in my home state of Western Australia over the past 2 years, and in the the great state of Tasmania, where Senator Polly comes from, which I've seen has just walked into the chamber. And I'll go through the figures now, Senator Polly. Like in the 2007 round, towards the end of 2007, this is what was allocated in the great state of Western Australia. 1,006 places were made available. That's what the government thought was needed to address the likely demand. How many places were taken up by providers in the aged care sector? 664. There was a shortfall of 342 beds. There's 342 fewer beds than what are required to provide the services that the government thought were required. Why is that? Because under the current funding and regulatory arrangements, investment in aged care is not viable, and the government is not doing anything about it. The government is spending everywhere else, but in the aged care sector, in the health and ageing portfolio more generally, we're talking fiscal restraint, budget cuts, and let's make sure that we get senior Australians to pay the price for Labor's reckless spending everywhere else. I promised Senator Polly I'd focus on Tasmania as well. So this is in the 2007 round. 104 beds the government thought were needed. 104 beds the government thought were needed. No, actually, sorry, 167 beds the government thought were needed. Only 63 of them were allocated. That's a shortfall of 104 beds in 2007. A shortfall of 104 beds out of 167. That is significantly more than half of the beds that the government thought were needed in aged care in Tasmania that are not being allocated. Now, I mean, at the time, the minister actually put out a press release at the time when these sort of figures came out, and she said, oh, well, everything is fine. Aged care industry is nice and healthy, financially sound. You know why she said that? Because in the states of New South Wales and Victoria, there was no shortfall. And some of these eastern states-centric Rudd government ministers find it very difficult to look past New South Wales and Victoria when it comes to assessing needs for services in states like Western Australia, and as it looks in states like Tasmania as well. Now, next year, I mean, people then would have thought, okay, well, maybe 2007, after the Rudd government was elected, maybe that was a bad year. Many people would say that was a bad year. Certainly people in the health and ageing portfolio are finding now that that was a terrible year, because all we've had is inaction, reviews, followed by reviews into reviews, budget cuts, tax hikes, and the old-fashioned crusade against private health. That's all we've had in the health and ageing portfolio. Head in the sand in the aged care sector, not facing up to the serious crisis that's taking place. But so what happened the subsequent year, the 2008-09 round, the 2008-09 round? Well, remember, a year before, it was only Western Australia and Tasmania that were under-allocated. So here we are now in 2008-09. All states but South Australia, every single state but South Australia had fewer beds taken up by providers than what the government thought were needed to provide adequate levels of services. New South Wales, 114 fewer beds taken up by providers than what the government thought was required, out of 2,106. In Victoria, 1,486 beds were made available, shortfall of 148 beds, 10%. In Queensland, significant in Queensland, 2,416 beds the government thought were required to provide the adequate level of services. What has been taken up by providers? 1,603. That's a shortfall of 813 beds. And again, my home state of Western Australia, it's an absolute disgrace what's happening there. Like out of 1,208 beds that the government thought were required, only 519 were taken up, less than half of what the government thought was required. And I could keep going on. But this is not the only problem. Not only are aged care providers not taking up the beds licenses that are made available by the government because they can't see that they would be financially viable, that it would be financially viable for them to do so. People are handing licenses back. Now, in Senate estimates, we've asked very detailed questions as to what's been happening, and the answers are terribly concerning. Now, between the 1st of December 2007, that's a short time after the Rudd government was elected to government, of course, between the 1st of December 2007 and the 25th of March 2009, 786 bed licenses were actually handed back. So here we have got the situation. Increasing demand because of an ageing population, people not taking up the bed licenses made available by the government, people handing back bed licenses that they've previously been allocated, and out of 786, how many of them do you think come from Western Australia, Senator Sterle? You're a senator for Western Australia. You should care about this. You should stand up to your government. You should say to the Prime Minister that it's time that he took some action. It is time that he remembered that the buck stops with him, because clearly the Minister for Health and the Minister for Ageing, they're clearly too junior. They clearly haven't got the pull across Cabinet. They clearly can't get the Prime Minister to focus on this. So it is time that the Prime Minister remembered that on aged care, on health, the buck stops with him. It is time that he took some action, because out of 786 beds that were handed back, 283 came out of Western Australia.
Order.
36.
Senator, order, please, Minister. Senator Cormann, if you don't direct comments at the opposition, they might be the other side. They might be less likely to interject, and I ask members of the government not to interject as Senator Cormann is speaking. Senator Cormann.
Now, Mr. Acting Deputy President, 36% of all bed licences that were handed back to the government since the election of the Rudd government were handed back in my home state of Western Australia, and the senators from the Labor senators from Western Australia, the government senators from Western Australia, are not doing anything about it. The few House of Representatives Labor members from Western Australia are not doing anything about it, and it is time that they stood up for Western Australia and for the needs of elderly, for senior West Australians when it comes to aged care. It's time that they stood up to the Prime Minister. Now, of course, we've had a whole series of reports. You, Mr. Acting Deputy President, will be well aware of the report that was put out by the Senate Standing Committee on Finance and Public Administration on the 29th of April in relation to residential and community aged care in Australia. That inquiry received 124 submissions. The committee made 31 recommendations. This is like months ago, 5 months ago, nearly half a year ago. The Minister still has not responded to any of the recommendations. There's been report after report. We've had the Trends in Aged Care Services Some Implications report from the Productivity Commission in September 2008. We've had another annual review of regulatory burden, social and economic infrastructure services Productivity Commission's interim report, in which it was stated that the high volume of meeting regulatory requirements comes at the expense of providing better care as staff in the aged care sector are directed to paperwork, a perverse outcome in a regulatory system that is designed to improve the quality of care rather than assisting senior Australians. And the Minister's approach clearly, rather than assisting senior Australians, the Minister's approach clearly is compromising their care. Now, these are just a few reports. We've also got the residential aged care surveys, like the Grant Thornton review, a whole series of other reviews. The James Underwood and Associates Bentley's MRI 2007 survey, a whole series of surveys which all say the same thing. And here we have actually got a statement provided to the Senate inquiry into residential and community aged care, signed together by Grant Thornton Australia, by James Underwood and Associates, Stuart Brown Business Solutions, which says that our research confirms, and I'm quoting, our research confirms that modern single-room high care services make very poor or negative returns on average. But these returns are far below the returns achieved in older shared room high care services. In our opinion, listen to this, modern single-room high care services other than those with extra services approvals are not viable under current funding and regulatory arrangements, are not viable. Now, the time for reviews is over. The time for more reports is over. This is time for action. It is time that the government pulled their head out of the sand and took some action when it comes to the needs in the aged care industry. Now, I mentioned before budget cuts. Look at this. So we're talking about this situation that is developing, where increasing demand, less like beds handed back, less beds taken up than what the government thinks are needed. And here we've got the Rudd government actually cutting funding to aged care in the 2009-10 budgets. And I'll just go through some of the examples. the government, the indexation of the conditional adjustment payment subsidy has been cut. The CIPs remain at 8.75% until 2011-12. There's discontinuation of assistive technology and community care program, 25.8 million lost over 4 years. Hearing services will introduce a minimum hearing loss threshold of more than 23 decibels to determine eligibility for hearing devices, losing $33.9 million over 4 years. Now, I mean, this is just extraordinary. I mean, this is aged care and services. Aged care services is a direct responsibility of the Commonwealth. A direct responsibility of the Commonwealth. And we've got all these spending sprees, all these cash splashes, this spendathon, the Julia Gillard Memorial Halls, and the signs in front of state and territory government schools, mismanaged, waste, like $1.7 billion overspent, $7 to $8 million for signs, and the core responsibility of the government is not being looked after. It's being neglected, and people are going to get hurt. If we don't take some action very soon, we're going to have some serious issues. Now the industry puts all of its surveys, all of its data out there for peer review. They say to people, okay, well, this is what we think. This is why we think that aged care is really facing a capital funding crisis. This is why we think that under the current funding and regulatory framework, we're going to have a problem in aged care moving forward unless there is some changes to the funding and regulatory framework. Now, the government, the department, the aged care divisions in the health and ageing department, do you know what they do? They spend most of their time explaining and defending and ducking and weaving as to why what others are saying, what everybody else is saying is wrong. I mean, they sort of come out and say, well, no, they're wrong because of this. And no, really, they say something different, and there's inconsistency there. And the industry has to continue to sort of, organise themselves and say, well, no, hang on, let's get together and let's just sort of swap notes and let's see what we've all said. And yes, we sign a joint statement, we all agree with the same thing. What does the government do? The government is collecting all of this data. They're doing all this internal research. And when we ask questions and estimates or during Senate inquiries, they say, oh, well, no, our research doesn't say that. No, our assessment of, of the data across Australia, we come up with very different conclusions. They say, well, show us your data. Show us what you've got. So we can, again, swap notes. There can be a peer review. We can scrutinise what you are basing your conclusions on. Because the industry experts say that the return on investment is about 1.1% on high care places in aged care. But the department said, oh no, it's 10%. 10% return on investment. But how do you get to that conclusion? So the Senate actually passed an order of the Senate a little while ago, which ordered the government to release all of the audited general purpose accounts from aged care providers since the 2004-5 financial year. When that information, essentially, information has to be submitted by aged care providers as a condition of receiving conditional adjustment payments every year. There's national de-identified comparative data from those accounts, which was expected to be made available every financial year to assist in performance benchmarking and in industry planning and investment decisions. But only the 2004-5 data was made available to the aged care industry, the Bentley's MRI report. Subsequent reports are being kept secret. Now, I actually asked some questions again, I put a question on notice. And I asked the question, can details be provided for individual facility, EBITDA data and performance for single and multi-bed facilities? The very helpful answer from this transparent, not government, was the de-identified unit record data is available on the department internet site at www.health.gov.au. Well, every single aged care provider across Australia, my staff, everybody that has an interest in this has been searching that website for the last couple of weeks. Nobody can find it. Nobody can find it. So I thought, well, if the government says it's available on the website in an answer to a question on notice, well, let's have a Senate order ordering for the production of documents. And what happened then? Oh, well, no, we didn't get a letter from the minister. The documents are files of my department. The files contain various documents which are now being examined with a view to provide an appropriate response to the Senate. etc., etc. We're going to take 30 days to have a look at it. Well, if it's so easy, if it's on the website somewhere, why don't you just table it? Why don't you just make sure that we can all work on the same basis? Mr. Acting Deputy President, as I'm running out of time, I just sum up. We are facing a serious crisis in the aged care industry, and it is time for some action. It is time that the Rudd government pulled their head out of the sand and faced up to the crisis. That's the first thing they have to do, face up to the crisis. And it is time that the Prime Minister remembered that in health and ageing, he promised that the buck would stop with him.
Thank you, Senator Cormann.